Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on your time zone. Welcome to today's webinar, Food Fraud Prevention, the Permanent Impact of COVID in Ukraine. My name is Amy. I'm a member of the marketing team here at the Perry Johnson Companies, and I'll be here helping to facilitate today's webinar and offer some technical support to our speakers. Today, we're welcoming not only Chris Reno, a member of the PJRFSI team, to the session, but Dr. John Spink as well. He should be a name that is familiar if you've attended one of our webinars before. Dr. Spink is the director of the Food Fraud Prevention Academy and an assistant professor at Michigan State University. Before we get started, I wanted to remind all of our attendees today that you will be on mute for the duration of the session just to ensure audio quality and bandwidth. However, we absolutely do want to take any questions that you might have regarding the material discussed. So two of the most common questions we get are regarding the slides and whether the broadcast is being recorded. And I'm happy to say that our slides will be available for download from the PJRFSI website, and we are indeed recording the session. So anyone who is unable to join us, or you maybe have to step away, you miss a section, you will be able to re-watch with the voiceover and the complete Q&A session free of charge on our YouTube channel. Just give us 24 to 48 hours to upload the slides and that recording, and they'll be available for you to review. Just really briefly, I wanted to touch on how you can ask us those questions. As I mentioned, we do want to hear from you, so feel free throughout the presentation. You don't have to wait until the end during the designated Q&A time to ask questions. Just ask them as they pop up, and that is to do that, you're gonna click on the little triangle on the left side of that question and answer tab on the control panel. And it should open up something that looks a little bit like this. There's a space there for you to type in a question. Just click the send button and we will get it on our side, and we'll be able to answer those questions like I said, at the end of the prepared slides. But now I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker today, and that's Dr. John Spink. Dr. Spink is the director of the Food Fraud Prevention Think Tank, and he's a lead instructor of the Food Fraud Prevention Academy, which provides free online training. He is also an assistant professor in the Department of Supply Chain Management at Michigan State University. He is a widely published author in a number of leading academic journals and has helped shape national and global perception of food fraud as a threat. Dr. Spink authored the very first textbook on the topic, titled Food Fraud Prevention, Development, Management, and Implementation, and that was back in 2019. Dr. Spink, thank you so much for once again returning to the stage here, so to speak, and joining us for this webinar.
Thank you. Glad to be here. And just first off, a sound check. Everything okay?
Everything sounds great.
Good. All right. Well, it's great to be back. You're an important audience, an important company, because you're the eyes and ears of all of us. So I haven't inspected one facility today, this week, this month. Haven't looked at a plan in live action as you have all the time. So your information and feedback is just really key. Again, I'm John Spink, so been interacting with food fraud and prevention for quite a while, and really for PJR has been a great partner. So we're going to dig again into food fraud prevention, but we're looking at the same issues from a little bit different perspective. And now we're looking at the permanent impact of COVID and Ukraine. It seems like these are all new. And I just got back from the Food Safety Summit, and some people will say, it looks like all your work is all over the place. Well, if we're looking at it from a food safety perspective, from a food perspective, then yeah, things like fraud, supply chain disruptions such as weather, Ukraine, COVID, cybersecurity, those are all seem to be very random. But if you look at it from the perspective of a disruption, they're all on the same path of just things that could lead to problems with resiliency or recovery or rateability in our supply chain. So that's what we're going to look at this time, is just kind of as a reminder of the keys that that are most efficient to have in place. And then just some things that you can do that apply specifically to from COVID and Ukraine, and then just to little questions for your own food safety management system and your food fraud prevention plan. My information's here. Feel free to contact me anytime. So first off, go back one. So this is not my first rodeo with all of you. So there's at least 4 of those sessions. I think we've actually got 8 that we've done. So there is a lot of background. So if some of this information, if there's some parts of this that you are need more background, then look, we've got some things. The very first one, food fraud, what you need to know. So those are some pretty simple, straightforward concepts. Also, a lot of resources from our end. Our focus is on free. So even our MOOCs, massive open online courses, those are pretty intensive on the basic concepts. We've got 6 of them, and then also 2 that were funded by USDA on their websites. Free open online. There are certificates of completion there. We're starting back on the executive education tour. So to be out live, we just did a certification workshop at the Food Safety Summit. We've limited action this summer, but we're really going to get going again next year. So stay in touch with us there. Also on the right is the textbook. So if you are struggling with putting together a food fraud prevention strategy, that should be the central resource. It was created to be everything. Everything from law enforcement priority setting to how much is enough to some basics on technologies. So that's a good resource for you. Also finishing up a book on supply chain management. So my role shifted over to supply chain management, and we're looking at the basic concepts. I use this as required reading in undergraduate classes. And so we're looking at the broad concepts there from a business perspective. It's looking at supply chain disruptions, which, as I mentioned, those are all the work I've been doing is really aligned on that vector. And has case studies of food fraud prevention. So we're letting the supply chain management students know about the food supply chain. So hopefully we'll be doing less persuasion of them. Cybersecurity and then applying enterprise risk management. That's a key to everything. And I think the more and more we get involved, the more that defining how much is enough is we're really finding out it's critical. This is required reading for all undergraduates. So it's got a starting point of very fundamental, but then gets to in a lot of details. And there's information if you want to subscribe to get an alert when it first comes out. We'll have some freebies for you, so register, and that might be a good thing for you. So just before we get into it, if you're new to the topic, food fraud is intentional deception for economic gain using food. It's really important that we always start with the definition because you may know it, but it's always good to remind you. I remember a couple years ago, there was a very senior leader at a food company, and he said, "John, I know you've been telling me for 2 years in a row, but I finally got it, this part of it." So I think it's good to just remind us. So it's all intentional acts. A lot of times we get looking at only ingredients coming in or substances, but we have to remember it's all types of fraud because all types of fraud could cause a problem. Stolen goods. Right now there was some stolen goods that were moving through new trade routes because of the routes that were disrupted by Ukraine and Russia. So that leads to some product that could be mishandled or stolen. But that intentional deception falls into that. And that broad definition is really consistent with the world. And specifically Codex. I need to add Codex to that. The Codex definitions are under draft status, and those are aligned here. If you're in the US, you might have heard of economically motivated adulteration more. That's an FDA term, and that was a term that was defined for a specific meeting that was looking at specifically the adulterated food section where there were substances that led to a public health threat. So EMA is specifically a substance for economic gain. So that's a subset as defined by FDA. Key is motivation. And when we think about putting together these big plans, we want to go to management systems to reduce prevention because we're trying to shift the motivation. We're not trying to catch anybody. We're not really worried about who's out there, who's in the marketplace, who's moving product around. If you reduce your vulnerability, then there's no opportunity. You could buy from Al Capone, and Al Capone wouldn't have a fraud opportunity to steal from you. And food defense is different. Food defense is intentional acts for harm. Someone that's, quote, good at food defense will find out pretty quickly because people are going to get sick or they're going to tell us where you can find the problem. So again, when we're looking at management systems, we're thinking about COVID, we're thinking about Ukraine, we need to think about where the pressure is going to be to implement systems. There's always an economic threat. There's not always a public health threat. So from this standpoint, right now, the urgency is finding calories, finding nutrition, finding grain for impoverished areas of the world. So people are trying to find supply. At that point, that type of supply does not have a public health threat. In fact, the public health threat is lack of supply. So there's naturally going to be product moving a little more freely. So that is not necessarily a threat, but it's a vulnerability. And that's the key. If you are buying, moving, selling, using product, there's a vulnerability. And so we need to really look back at our management systems to make sure that they're set up so that we can really look at all these types of issues, specifically COVID and Russia and Ukraine, as well as respond to other issues. So how we do that, the real key is that it's not just one idea. We don't just throw out something and say, you need to figure out how to work it into the system. We want to go end to end to show you exactly how to do it and where to do it. And the key is the required documents for GFSI compliance, which is really for all food safety management systems, which is just good practice. And first is that vulnerability assessment. So that's a real key when you find new issues, new concerns, as we'll cover like with Ukraine, of some products that we know that are produced in high quantities in Ukraine that are going to that were going to and then did create disruptions in the marketplace, spikes in prices. Then that should be a part of the vulnerability assessment. That's exactly where this all fits in, us looking for those problems. And if we have a good vulnerability assessment that's very proactive, it might be once a month you have a emerging issues team. Have a lunch, have the coffee in the afternoon, and sit around and look at the newspaper, look online and find some things that might be new. That fits into the vulnerability assessment. Then you figure out what's worse for you: red, orange, yellow, green, blue. Look at the chart there, because just because there's an issue in the world doesn't mean it's a problem for you. Either the likelihood could be so low or the consequence so low that it's well within your risk tolerance. Still something to watch, but it might not be a problem for you. That's where it all fits in. That information flows into that vulnerability assessment. And then is the prevention strategy. And this gets to be a management system. So strategy is just the plan. Management system is implementing and monitoring it. And there on the bottom is the food fraud prevention cycle, which came about from a lot of companies with our research projects of trying to piece it all together. So that's where this new information, such as disruptions from COVID that were constantly disruptions, they fit into the system under new information, and the product flow the process flows from there. And then if we have we think about things in three levels. We think of operational, which is right now, today, what do we need to do? Tactical is a little bit more like how should we organize our activities, a little bit different. And strategically is at the very high level, like really big picture, things that could disrupt our company or create a market. So when we're talking about things like sunflower oil from Ukraine, the operational issue at the start is, where can we find it? And then is it going to be diluted, the product that we're receiving? And then tactically is more like, well, longer term, where are there going to be different ports that it's coming from? Are there different types of sunflower oil? Maybe you do a different type of authenticity test. Strategic is the very highest level. Then you really should go around that to tactical and end up to strategic, to say things within your company like, if we think that the supply is going to be hindered for more than a year or 5 years, or gone for 5 years, depending on where all the activity is going on over there, then that would be good information to feed into your company to say the fraud opportunity is going to remain very high, so there's concern with the product, or just the key is that there's going to be less product in the marketplace. The price is going to double for the next 5 years. All of a sudden, if you've got people that are doing research and development, then it would be really good for them to know earlier in the process if they really should or either that they build into their models that sunflower oil is going to be double or 3 times the price, or that there'll be short supply, or if they can get out of sunflower oil. Do they really need to be in sunflower oil? So everything we're doing here, when I say the permanent shift, is us to look at the systems we have and then just kind of make sure we're broad enough to cover all these new types of disruptions. So what we're going to be doing is applying these supply chain disruptions to COVID. So we'll do a little background on COVID, and then the Ukraine, Russia, we'll look a little background there, and then say, and then now what? And again, I try to not just tell you about problems. I'm trying to not just tell you have cancer and that you might die in a month. I try to also tell you things that you can do and give that realistic perspective at that end of it. So we say, kind of like as someone said, deja vu all over again. Well, it was COVID the first time. It was Delta and Omicron and whatever. It feels like we've got another wave. I just heard that what the port of Shanghai might be, or one of the ports in China is shutting down again due to COVID. It's the same thing all over again. It's just crazy. But the thing is that we're now building in repeatable port closures as just part of our the information that we're reviewing. So when we look at these two issues, Massive supply chain disruptions. That's obviously, I mean, that's just common practice, common knowledge. We didn't see this all coming. We didn't see, the multiplier effect of Ukraine on top of COVID. There's going to be definitely ongoing future supply challenges. So absolutely, we already were having constrained resources around the world. We were having reduced production in a lot of countries with a lot of products. We're seeing prices going up already because of scarcity. Number one issue is assurance of supply. So that's a real key, and we need to be aware of that. We need to accept that. As food safety people, the procurement people, believe it or not, their goal is not to wake up every day and make your life more difficult. Their goal is to do procurement and within specifications that they're given. And actually, I just presented to procurement executives in our MSU business program, executive education program. It was really fascinating to joke with them that believe that the food safety people think that their life was trying to make our life hard. It's not. So, but we have to be aware that companies could go out of business if we don't get supply. So we're going to have to be flexible, resilient. We're going to have to be adaptive to new sources. Don't forget, though, as we have to remind everybody else that the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act and FSMA are still in effect. You're still required to provide safe and legal product. So the same purchasing managers would then say, well, what should we be looking for? And that's a part of doing these management systems of prevention strategies. And just to remind people that the adulterated foods and misbranded food requirements are still in effect. So let's say that you're buying a product that's Ukrainian sunflower oil, and all of a sudden now it's really Greek sunflower oil. Well, it may be completely fine from an adulterated food standpoint, public health just fine, good manufacturing practices, but that would be misbranded foods if it wasn't, if the labels weren't updated. So a reminder is under the assurance of supply that if we're going to change supply sources or routes or whatever, we're going to have to just understand that there's things that we might need to do from a labeling or statement standpoint, such as customs. And the key then, we're going to see this eventual restart of deeper food safety and related supplier quality assurance audits. But there's also going to be a new normal of web audits. And I think that's great. We've been doing, like with students and teaching, we're doing a lot more pre-lecture assessments. We're doing a lot of little quizzes, readings before they actually get into the lecture hall. And that leads us then, when we're together, we can work on a lot of higher level interactions and concepts and content and applications. So that's going to be a real key. Is I think a lot of this food fraud vulnerability assessments, especially, they can be done under a new normal of web audits. You also can do how many in a day, which is really great. Instead of all the travel, it limits the amount that you could be conducting. Now, though, we're seeing corporation, and whether you're looking at the the business journals, business magazines, the highest level consultancies, they're starting to look at with assurance of supply, to go back and look at what's been going on in the past, because maybe there's some specifications were a little bit looser, and maybe there's some supply issues or some performance issues in the field. So at the board level, there's a look back at the business. And a key there, you'll be asked now to demonstrate your past compliance. If things were kind of fast and loose there when we're looking at assurance of supply, there will probably be a look back. So you want to get these management systems in place. Real briefly about COVID, let's kind of review that. So if you did, let's say that on January 2020, you had your annual crazy incident review. Then would COVID have popped up? Because for us, it was March 11th when we pivoted online completely for our classes. So January was earlier than that. So the question is to look at, if you did go looking for it, would there have been some issues? For New York Times, pick any international news outlet. It was not on the front page. In the Asia Pacific section, there was a mention, but there wasn't an alarm. It was something that just looked like another SARS, maybe, mysterious illness. SARS, they said it was kind of SARS-like, and then just was saying they hope it didn't have an outbreak. And of what they were talking then was 800 people died. So worldwide. So at that point, this was just a normal kind of thing. It wouldn't have raised alarms for us, especially if you're a U.S. company or a company not doing specific business in or from China. So if we look at COVID-19, is it a food fraud risk? When you're looking at your assessment and prevention strategy, would you have considered it? The key is not looking at COVID itself, because COVID didn't make animals sick, or didn't make listeria more aggressive. But the key is there's add-on effects, and there are vulnerabilities or hazards of COVID-related supply chain disruptions. COVID led ports to shut down. They led to maybe less testing, less inspection. That's what then led to these vulnerabilities. Remember, the Food Safety Modernization Act and U.S. law says a hazard analysis must be written regardless of outcome, and that includes hazards intentionally introduced for the purposes of economic gain, meaning that we're really required by law to start looking for those type of hazards, like that product that's maybe it's moved to a different port. It's maybe the port is offloading in a different way. They're not following some practices, regular practices, because they are short-staffed, or the staff isn't the port staff isn't familiar with the food offloading practice or standards. So key there is to keep doing that hazard analysis. More broadly, how do these supply chain disruptions or economic disruptions change the business fraud risk? So when we look at not just food fraud, but business fraud, that will give us an indicator of where there are other food fraud opportunities. So it gets down to the question, what should you do? How much is enough for your response? And then reminding us, though, that even though we're in a crisis mode, just trying to maintain that continuity, that the food safety and food fraud requirements are still in place. You're still required to provide legal product. So that's just as a reminder. And I think it's important when someone says, why are you not loosening up the rules so we can get more product through, so we can keep the product running? Just to remind people about that well, we have to be buying legal product. So when we look at COVID, was COVID a reasonably foreseeable event? Now let's say COVID as a global pandemic, but let's not say a pandemic that disrupts things for 2 years. But still, let's look back at it. Black swan event is a rare event that is so unheard of, unthought, unexpected, that it changes the entire world and no one would ever look for it. Or is it reasonably foreseeable? So the coronavirus, COVID-19, was just one of many, 5 global events in the last 17 years. I don't know if you think of 5 in 17 years as a lot or little, but it's a number, and it's more than one, and it has happened before. So it's not completely unheard of. Now, you could say out of that time, maybe there was 1,000 or 10,000 outbreaks of some kind every year. So 5 out of 17,000 or 170,000 is different than 5 out of 17, but still global events of pandemics have occurred. Remember, MERS, Ebola, avian influenza, SARS, and then there's a list from the WHO of those 17 other pandemics. So pandemics have been known. Question then is, did a company have at the enterprise level, at the highest levels, the monitoring of things like pandemics to see if this trigger was coming? Now, to be fair, COVID was so big and massive that no one could have been completely had enough inventory or enough resiliency to overcome it. And that there's some things that are just so massive, so all-encompassing that we wouldn't cover that unless it was a critical infrastructure such as maybe military or something like that. And WHO did have this article, 10 Threats to Global Health, and number 1 was a pandemic influenza. So it was a known out there. Pandemic should have probably been something that companies were monitoring a little bit more. Now, when there's a more strategic look at enterprise risk and managing and monitoring systems, now corporations at that highest level are saying, yeah, this should be in our set of factors that we're looking for. And our research in supply chain disruptions is now making sure to include that as a specific event. So now what for food fraud prevention? So that's really, it seems like we get close to food fraud and then we go back out, in and back out. Well, the key is we're trying to look at the problem from all directions. So far, we're looking at this that we probably should have known of some of these events. They're really big, they're catastrophic, but they didn't show up that early. So 3 months before for an event like this, and you're looking in January for that March. If you looked in January, then, well, the cycle probably needs to be a little bit sooner than every quarter right there. Now let's look at Ukraine. So I actually had an application in one of the lectures with the undergraduate students And we looked at it on March 3rd, which was 7 days after the invasion. So we're looking at what could be the disruptions. And the key was the process. How would we look at an event and try to analyze it? So we focused on what to do. Was the deliverable was then, well, it was 3 lectures later, 2 lectures a week, so the 14th. So we looked on the 3rd to have this review of what to do there on the 14th. So we looked at a point in time snapshot of what was happening there, in the couple days after the 3rd, but included identification of factors and scenario variables that are in scenarios. So along the way, I mean, March 3rd was 7 days in. Maybe at 14 days, the Russians turned around and drove out with no other stress points. That could have happened. The other is they could have got through the whole country in 7 days. So there were a lot of scenarios. And to be a good business, to be proactive, it's to then look at all those and be ready for be monitoring for what's the most likely outcome and those extreme events. And while there are many big food supply chain issues, we look to drill into actionable intelligence and focus on food fraud prevention. So it's really kind of too much to think about the biggest picture in the world and every single commodity and what could happen over the next 10 years. We focused in on really immediate, say the next month, or there it was for the March 14th, and look for actionable intelligence. And what that means is that we're looking for things that we can actually do. And the focus was food fraud prevention. So we did a detailed, in-depth literature search, information search. We looked at it from a supply chain disruption academic perspective, as well as from a food fraud subject matter expert insight. The methodology we used, what says COVID there, it should say Ukraine, but the methodology was to, just first off, we accepted that the disruption was totally and completely uncertain. No one had any idea what was going to happen along the way. And so the traditional resources and responses to food fraud prevention may be outdated immediately. The entire landscape needed to be reviewed. I mean, if you think about it, there's not a lot of production in Ukraine right now of legitimate product or fraudulent product. I mean, if you were monitoring fraudulent product from the Ukraine, I'm guessing that production, in pure guess, educated guess, is reduced by at least 80%. They're having trouble getting, keeping the utilities on, product flow. Also think about exports. So if you're making any product legitimate or counterfeit, fake, then you're still having trouble getting it out of the country. So even those kind of things have completely changed. What we did is we looked at, we had to back up. Usually we're at the very bottom there in the supply chain disruptions, where we just have something happened and we respond, like melamine's found in horse meat. But we really had to go back and then with Russia, Ukraine, everything's changing so fast and it's so volatile that we had to look at scenarios. And not just several scenarios, to figure out what the scenarios were, we had to go back and look at the events. So the details of what caused disruption. And something that was, again, extremely unique here, not just the industry scenarios that Michael Porter and competitive strategies would talk about, we're talking about geopolitical. So we had to go even one layer back of the basics of production and details, and even to look at things like Ukrainian agricultural production. So the question was in March, what's the status of the agricultural calendar? And at that point, they should have been preparing their fields for fertilizing and then later seeding. And in May, I think it was around when a lot of the products they were putting in the seeds in. So when we looked at March, we saw the disruption. We saw a disruption in fuel. So things like tractors couldn't get there. Agricultural chemicals, if they weren't already in the country, we're going to have trouble moving around. So we had to go back with all these scenarios to a much deeper level. If you have a food fraud prevention strategy or a corporate enterprise risk strategy looking at these emerging issues, then you would have realized that you had to keep going back from disruptions to scenarios to event to the base. But you would have asked that question. So the base event. So here's what we see feeding in. Again, it should say Ukraine at the top there. But what's clear is the event in Ukraine and Russia created tremendous supply chain disruptions, or was going to, and stressors that vastly increased the fraud opportunity. Now, we don't know exactly what happened because it takes a while for us to figure out what happened with the crime, but we could see that the vulnerability was definitely there, system weaknesses. And one scenario is the recovery ag and food production is undefined. One scenario is 10 years, because think if battles are occurring in the production fields, then not only are they not planting, but those fields need to be cleaned up. Even if it's just humans that were living there, human waste would need to be recovered. And the amount of Ukraine-Russia food production is above 50% for many products. So immediately, it would be known, even if Russia turned around that day and drove out of the country, there was going to be some level of disruption immediately. But all of a sudden, if we're looking at a year or years, then thinking of 50% of the production, that's going to have a big issue, ripple around the world immediately and for a long time. And that the specific products themselves are sunflower, rapeseed oil, other seeds, cottonseed oil, but also fertilizer and animal feed. And that's from Ukraine, but also looking at Russia. And along the way, a scenario was that exports from Russia would shut down or be reduced, but also Russia's ability to produce things like replacement parts for agricultural equipment. And then there are other high value products along there like honey and things, and grains, of course, which everybody knows about. So the thing is, reporting those novel food fraud incidents could lag weeks or months, because gathering information is really methodical. But also, who's doing a lot of food safety testing or food fraud testing in Ukraine or Russia right now that's being shared out. So there's just not going to be a lot of information there. Now you have two choices. You can either wait for real data on those incidents and other people getting recalled or your product getting recalled, or you can look at it as an enterprise-wide issue and risk and just say, you know what, let's deal with this at the highest level and see what it is we should be doing. Okay, just a second. It's not advancing. There we go. Okay. So what to do? So I've tried to do this where we go in to something detailed and then completely confuse you and come back out and then try to get to something real basic. So what to do? And I think at the very beginning, you want to start with a simple focus on the basics. And overall, if we see the bottom here is your food fraud prevention strategy and a management system. So part of it is to say, how do we respond to these operational issues, the immediate issue, like finding more sunflower oil or checking on those deliveries. But then you're thinking bigger as well, as changing supply routes. A lot of people immediately moved their ships out of those regions because they thought there may be some type of other disruptions. There's also a parallel system here in supply chain disruptions. And so it's really excellent from a food safety standpoint if you find out what's being done in your global supply chain management systems, because a lot of times you can either learn from them or be very integrated with them on resilience and response systems. The key is we want to focus on those basics. Focus on the standard operating procedures. So go back to the process steps that you have that you follow, and then check them to see if they're working out. And obviously, a lot of them are going to need to be adjusted, like those scenario planning. From disruptions, we realized we couldn't just look at that event information at the end. We did have to go all the way up to the base and geopolitical issues. And focus on your management system. So again, at first we work on the operation, just getting through the day, and then figure out are there some things after we do that, come back to it and look at it tactically. Are there some things we should adjust? And then get done with that and then come back to it. Make sure you come back to it. That's a management system. It's a process. Come back to it and look strategically. And at the highest level, are there some things that we wish we would have had in place? And I'll just ask you is, do you have a real food fraud management system? And then I'll also ask, do you have standard operating procedures? When COVID and Ukraine came up, did you ask questions early? And then did you have kind of a playbook to go to? Did you have standard processes? We did, but then we realized very quickly that from those basics, the fundamentals, we had to adjust. And we did that by being simple and focus on the basics. We couldn't think about everything at once. We couldn't think about entire companies or supply chains. So what we did is then we drilled into looking at those issues and tried to see what we were doing with those basics. So what are the food fraud prevention basics? And so remember that this is the gap analysis, what we talk about constantly, but think about it in the frame of permanent addition of novel emerging risks and issues. So think about that. So first off, have you conducted a food fraud vulnerability assessment? Well, yeah, if you're on this call, I bet you have. And is it written? Yeah, you've got, at least to some level, you've got it. Prevention strategy, yes. Is it written? Well, now we're starting to talk about, does it include, looking at emerging issues? Well, let's just say at this point you have that. There's other questions that are more applicable. Demonstrate implementation. So that's different than what we're dealing with COVID in Ukraine. But demonstrate implementation would be things like explaining what I did above, that review of Ukraine, that we then adjusted our scenario development, and that would be demonstrating implementation if you could show that type of slide. Executive level sign off, that's a part of the overall system itself. But a key is that that's just a part of the overall plan. Minimally conduct an annual food fraud incident review. So let's say we did it January. So yeah, okay, you did that one there in January. At least you did it. Now, this is one of the keys for COVID and Ukraine. Method to review your incidents and general market incidents. So it's one thing that things are occurring, but overall, I'd point out that part of it. Maybe it's your plan maturing a bit to talk about general market incidents, and it might mature a bit to look at general market factors, and could be then, hopefully then you were meeting on a, even if it was a regular food fraud prevention meeting monthly, that someone said, hey, at least if it made it on the agenda to talk about the possibilities of things from COVID as it was coming and evolving, and Ukraine. At that point, then when you look at those issues such as sunflower oil, then it becomes really logical. If you're looking for it, then you can early see actions you should have in place. I think that's the real key, the real part of the gap analysis to look at for what we've got with these emerging issues. So does it address all types of fraud? That's also another good one, because what we've got is things like a lot more the country of origin fraud, intentional or not, really, because sometimes even the suppliers are just trying to meet their order, and maybe they forget to update the certificate of analysis to say that it's Greek sunflower oil, not Ukrainian. But if you're looking at all types of fraud, including country of origin claims, then that was something that you would be aware of along the way. And also then all product in the marketplace. So also product going out, because maybe you've got some products that are high in sunflower oil or something. They could all of a sudden be a target of theft or dilution by distributors along the way. So when we look back at the gap analysis, this is always a good way to look back and give us a process check. And I think the real keys there for the permanent shift of these emerging issues is looking at step 8, which is the general market incident review of what you do and adding in there emerging issues. And then also, as you look at emerging issues, to ask the questions of whether there's a bit of a change in the focus or vulnerabilities for all types of fraud and different types of product fraud. So when you're looking at these hot activities to management systems, set the methods and the policies. And so you meet monthly, and one part of the agenda is emerging and hot topics. And then part of the compliance plan is, did you cover every item on the agenda? And if you kept forward that one to next month, and you missed out on some key COVID or Ukraine issues, then that just reinforces that you really should go back to really being strict about those policies and review that process and reporting. And a key with compliance is at the highest levels, they want to know, number one, you have a plan. Number two, you follow it with documentation, and then you update it and refine it. And that's exactly the process here, is to look back at what could you have had in place, what would you have liked to have in place, what worked, what didn't work, and then you refine your own policies, and you make it more required maybe that that you definitely a review of emerging issues is not an item that can be forwarded to the next meeting. And do things like look on the food fraud prevention cycle, the way that you identify your processes of where you want to deal with this new issue. And it could be under things like horizon scanning or future, looking at the future issues. You could then look in there to see if you want to deal with emerging issues. And to remind you, if you haven't seen it, but if you have seen it, then we're going to point out specifically where things have changed, is a food fraud prevention cycle. This is what an overall management system looks like. when it's implemented. So at the background, there's the academic disciplines. So we're the ones that will go to, risk management and scenario planning, global economics, macroeconomics, filter those down for you, and then fundamental concepts that gets into things like risk as well. And remember, our goal is to be a good guardian, to protect the supply chain and the customers essentially. So we're trying to keep the product flowing, which means the product is safe and healthy. And we've got is the cycle. It's the same old cycle that we've been using. This is actually plan, do, check, act. If it's the Deming wheel or risk management, it's really simple concepts, but it's been adjusted specifically to food fraud. And at the center is that crime opportunity or the fraud opportunity. So right there, when we take a moment to look at it and see that's point number 2, step 2 at the top. When we look at things like these supply chain disruptions from Ukraine, maybe product going through different ports, that shifts to fraud opportunity. That could be mislabeling at ports, and that's all may not have been such a big issue in the past, but it is now. And then we have to remember that these assessments are key. And initial screening, I mean, you can do these assessments without a lot of time or effort or data even. And in the COSO ERM practices, the initial screening is a qualitative measure. It could be you by yourself in 15 minutes to think about Ukraine. It could be a small group of us that we're thinking about Ukraine, looking at different markets. And then over time, you'll figure out for the questions that you're asking if you need more detailed information. And that's where that assessment is still there, still fundamental, so it still works. And the part that we're looking at here is under how new information comes in. And we separate them from incidents, scanning, and public policy. The key here, I would say, is the scanning piece. So they're on 7 days after the Russian invasion, which actually was a little late. If you had a really robust program to look at emerging issues, you were looking at it as they were massed at the border. Now, people constantly mass the border, do exercises, military exercises, joint exercises around. But so you weren't ready to start stockpiling sunflower oil, but it would be something that you'd been more aware of. And there were some trigger points back in there that gave us some information that this was different than some previous type of issues. So under that scanning is a key for us to look at what we're looking at scanning wise. And so that's where this information of looking at global emerging issues could be another item under there. So under scanning, we might have multiple levels of looking at recall alerts or something like that, but as well as geopolitical. And that leads us around the cycle through the assessment, enterprise risk, look at those risks, into what we do for countermeasures, traceability, investigation or audit, and testing. And really, when we think at the higher level, that's not enough. So again, if you're a company that's saying, well, show me the data, where has there been supply chain disruptions from Ukraine or food fraud? What do we, where are the bodies? Well, the key is that the bodies aren't going to be, we're not going to be aware of the bodies for a while, or it's going to be a little while until those bodies actually do, someone does get sick enough because the product's moving through the supply chain. So you can either wait and you can do that traceability and inspection and testing, or you can, with countermeasures, you could be more proactive, even longer term. And that could be, again, like looking at getting out of some of those products. But at the same time, before we have data, we still would know from the initial screen that the chance that sunflower oil or some of those other oils, whether they're coming from Ukraine or not, could be fraudulent. At that point through this cycle, I think it would come in there as scanning to say, hey, new issue, fraud opportunity, definitely fraud opportunity with reduction of supply. At least the initial screening would say that this is an enterprise-wide problem. It could be an intolerable risk. And the key with that, then, it does go around, and we then at that point would probably start to do things like dilution testing. Look for dilution of sunflower oil, and if there is a authenticity test for sunflower oil from Greece versus Ukraine, those are things that you could start to get ready to put in place or have in place. So the key is looking at that early on, running it through that assessment. Now, if your company feels like it's not a risk, then you're just monitoring it. You've done your job. You've brought it in. You tried to do that assessment. Someone else is telling you that it's within your risk tolerance. So at that point, you just actively monitor. Call to action. So we're boiling down to it. Process check. Question is, what would you have liked to have had in place? I think that's really a key to take a moment to think about that. Would you like to have had that monthly food fraud prevention team meeting where you do look at it and look at these massive emerging issues. Those are overall questions. And then, what are best practices within your company for horizon scanning or early warnings? So at this point, to look at, even to ask people in general, who do you think was really proactive? Who did a good job of seeing this or moving on this early on? And you want to figure out who those people are and figure out what they did, but also how you could maybe change what you do as well. And then you want to implement the food fraud prevention strategy as a management system. And that's a key where you've got the full feedback, and you've got these policies and practices that you're really implementing and following. And the steps, real simply, could be to first gather your vulnerability assessment, search for any unknown incidents or suspicious activity. So did you find anything with Ukraine, Russia, those products, any suspicious, any different trade routes, any odd tests that came up? Review your current purchase history versus a year ago and look for changes. So not saying anything's wrong with that, but a lot of times that assurance of supply led us to find other suppliers or other types of products that we're bringing in. Maybe the specification changes. You used to buy stuff that was plus or minus 50, whatever. Now you're buying plus or minus 100, or people have had an audit in the last year or 2 years or whatever. But just look for changes. Anytime there's a change, there's a potential for system weakness. I'm not saying fraud occurs there, but it could. And then ask for a team to conduct a review of those vulnerabilities and then try to prioritize the worst concerns. So even if at this point you're not recommending spending any money, all you're doing is doing the assessment, and you're looking at that to see what is above the risk tolerance and what's not. Work with your team and consider your actions. At that point, then you're just trying to understand which of these issues, whether you have data or not, are above the risk tolerance, and then what the overall company risk managers, senior managers feel that you should do. Again, there might be implementing some tests. It might be some different things to try to reduce your fraud opportunity. Document, 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 and document the process. Not just when you met, but document the fire drill. What happened? How did you do? Think about that as well as when the information came in. Who would you like to have had in the meeting earlier on? And then hopefully that you have a roadmap when these things occur again, and they will occur again. So with that, looking pretty good on the time. It didn't speak too fast for you, but tried to give you a little bit of background and just to look at the same processes. A lot of these concepts are very familiar to you if you've been following food fraud prevention. It's just now looking at it and maturing it in a little way specifically for these emerging issues.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Spink. Really quick, I am going to pull the keyboard and mouse back. And then for those who do download the slides, here's this acknowledgement slide that has some resources that Dr. Spink chose to share. But we're going to go right into the Q&A now. We do have about 10 minutes left. And while you guys send in your questions, I hope all the content inspired some curiosity or questions about theoreticals, whatever. I will say that again, the slides and the recording of the entire session will be available within the next 24 to 48 hours. You'll be able to find the recording of this webinar as well as Dr. Spink mentioned, all of the other webinars that he's featured in with us on our YouTube channel for free. So if you just simply search PJRFSI or Perry Johnson Registrar's Food Safety, the channel should come up and you'll be able to search on the channel for those as well. All right, but first off, I did want to ask Dr. Spink, in terms of current events and current issues that with the possibility for food fraud, and with us being in Michigan, so close to the quote unquote action, do you have any thoughts on the baby formula shortage and the Abbott closure at the plant in Michigan as far as food fraud?
I was talking. Well, I mean, anytime there's a severe shortage, there's fraud opportunity. And the key is that most companies, in this case the retailers, are aware of that, and they know when they're buying from a premium, the regular authorized channel, and they know when they're buying from an unauthorized, or not an unauthorized, but maybe not the formal challenge. They're trying to find product to put on the shelf. And some of it could be like near expiration date that went to an expediter or somebody. And so the key there is that when within the food fraud prevention plan strategy, part of that should be in the countermeasures is to be aware if you're buying under normal circumstances, if you're buying through your normal authorized distributors, your tier one suppliers, then that's one thing because you're trusting them to make sure that the product they ship you is okay. If you're now buying from new suppliers, that's a question of, remember I had in there looking at changes in suppliers or products. If all of a sudden you see a spike from a new supplier, that's the area where you should look. And in that case, then, as products coming in, would be to do more, authenticity tests, either of the product or of the labeling. People do mass balance to check the production or check the original orders. If they say they bought the product from whoever, then you can look at those invoices. So there's traceability. And if you remember, that slide did have traceability, inspection, audit, and testing. And that's really what should be in place when you're using these non-routine purchases. And even so many times when we do a food fraud initial screening or vulnerability assessment, is I ask to say, well, what percentage of your business is spot? I said, oh, we don't buy spot. I said, okay, you've never, ever bought spot. And they'll say, oh, well, we did those a couple times. I said, okay, so just add it. So
Just
there
for that
should be
one
in there.
run. Yeah.
There should be, the process should be that if we do by spot, we do these other things. And so that could be quarantining it or getting a bond or things like that. And that, see, right there is, let's look at what we wish we would have had in place.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. All right, we do have a question here. This one is from Jenna. It's a two-parter. So first off, Jenna is asking, are you aware of any known adulteration risks in the food packaging sector? And then she goes on to ask, aside from a strong approved supplier program, including the requirement of a third-party certification, such as SQF or BRC, are there any other assessments that should be done to ensure safe and quality products being delivered by a company's suppliers?
Yeah. Well, number one is before everything, and I'm guilty of not following my own advice as well. But whenever you hear of anything, you need to do an initial screening. You need to think about the likelihood and the consequence, and that's a real key. So when we think about like packaging, let's say, we're talking food fraud, not food safety. So right there is a difference. So it's one thing if mice are running all around a factory. That's a food safety issue. It's not, they don't intentionally release the mice. Their goal wasn't to have the mice droppings on the product for you. So that's a food safety. We're talking about food fraud. So the likelihood that there could be some type of packaging fraud. Well, the question would be is, well, how do you buy the package? Is the package really unique? Is it a special barrier property that's really expensive that you can't see? There's one thing if it's got a mylar layer in it, that's a shiny looking aluminum foil type film looking thing. So if there wasn't that layer wasn't there, then you'd see it. So part of it is the performance. Is there something that would differentiate a product? A lot of times packaging, it's not really high tech packaging. It's very close in spec, but so part of it, the likelihood may be low because to swap it, there might not be a lot of opportunity, but also you're buying directly from a lot of times you're buying directly from a supplier. And then the consequence. So let's say that you bought a 10 mil bag that's really 9 mil. Okay, so what would be the consequence? You didn't label it saying this is a 10 mil bag, and that wouldn't be then mislabeling. So the consequence for mislabeling would be low. The question would be things like food safety. Could there be a problem with food safety of a thinner bag? And that's a possibility, but we'd really look at the vulnerability assessment of that. I feel like I didn't answer that question.
Well, I actually want to jump in here. So, Dr. Spink, I think, these days with a lot of boutique packaging that's out there, right? You see it in certain sectors, hemp, CBD, personal care products, things like that are spending a lot of money on the packaging as a form of marketing.
Right.
And you're also starting to see a lot of certifications. I've seen certifications of things that being in the industry, I'm like, this is made up. I've never heard of such a thing. So, people are putting stamps on things and doing things like that. But are you seeing any sort of uptick in, the last few years with COVID? We have, inspected less, of course, right? So
right.
people are getting away with more and more, and we're kind of, bringing that back in now. But, I don't know the question from Jenna specifically, but are you starting to see any sort of enforcement or crackdown in the packaging industry where a company might say, hey, we're using 100% biodegradable plastic or, paper in XYZ fashion, when in actuality that's not the product that they're using?
Yeah.
And it's really just, we're going to do this until we get fined, and then we're going to reevaluate.
Yeah, well, I would say that, I mean, I'm not getting called for specific incidents of that. So, I mean, is there a fraud opportunity? Absolutely. Absolutely. And so a key there is back to the fundamentals of how do you authenticate your product, who are your suppliers, and then doing a vulnerability assessment. If you find that let's say that it's a specialty mint leaf stem uh, packaging that's a
Sure.
waste product. If there's something that's really in short supply or eliminated supply, then that's something that should go back into the vulnerability assessment when you're looking at emerging issues. But it's all back to the likelihood and consequence. So so let's look at, let's say that it's 100% biodegradable or whatever, 50% renewable, whatever in the package. That's on the label. So then the question gets to be is how does that fit on the consequence, such as is it a violation of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act, or is it a FCC marketing label violation? So it really does get down to the likelihood and consequence of it occurring. Now, a real simple is that it was just somebody. Oh, I know what it was. There was a manufacturing company that makes like parts for in homes, metal parts that you'd use in homes, and zinc. Supposedly zinc was a shortage of zinc, and zinc is also a byproduct of some uh, uh, radiation related materials. So some of the zinc was actually fraudulent from that. It was a byproduct that had actually radiation on it. So the key is once they figured that out, then they just put radiation detectors. The vulnerability, likelihood was very low, but it could happen. The consequence was extremely high. I mean, how long would they have to shut down their facilities? So they also looked at the countermeasure. See, remember the cycle all the way around, countermeasure. So one thing they did is they just put Geiger counters on their receiving docks, and they let their suppliers know that they had Geiger counters on their receiving docks. So before that truck was allowed to unload or even pull up to the facility, they had a Geiger counter, and so they didn't have any fraud opportunity. The key there is they found something, it got into their system to do an assessment, and they looked at the likelihood and consequence, and they also looked at in relation to the cost and the confidence in a countermeasure.
Great. Thanks. Great
Awesome. Thank
question.
you.
Thank you, Jenny.
Yeah, Jenna, if that didn't answer your
Jenna.
question fully, please do let us know. Just pop back into that question box really quick. I did want to clarify a point with you, Dr. Spink, on behalf of Frank here. Frank is asking, so food fraud necessitates malicious intent, true or false?
Food fraud, well, we have to clarify malicious intent. The intent is economic gain. So someone is trying to do this to make money for themselves. They're not trying to harm anybody else. Now, harm could be inadvertent, like selling the zinc with radiation in it. Let's see, I would believe that they're selling it to try to just sell the zinc. They're not trying to destroy this company or give people cancer. Now, the other side of that, malicious intent with the intent to harm, would be food defense, where they would be spiking the product, making sure to have product that's spiked with radiation to disrupt manufacturing or make people sick or create terror. So a key there with let's say intent is key, but intentional deception or intentional harm, real important to separate those. And it's important to separate those because we're trying to prevent it. And if someone's putting that radiation in the zinc to harm people, that's very different than the motivation. The people that are selling the zinc just to cheat us, they don't want to get caught. They would then steal genuine zinc and sell it to us instead of the zinc with the radiation.
Yeah, so they're trying to make a buck. They're not trying to,
Right.
harm anybody or, say that they dislike the company they work for, so they're deliberately screwing around on the production floor and causing
Uh-huh.
damage to product. So, okay. Thank you for
Yep.
the clarification.
Yeah, and like you said, I mean, the food defense is obviously a really big issue as well, and maybe something that's we can talk about on a later webinar because they do go pretty hand in hand
Yep.
with the way that you are mitigating those risks. But yeah, two very different things in the way that one benefits financially, where one is intended to create harm.
Right.
Absolutely. I'm going to really quick just toss this contact information back up on the screen. If anyone has any other questions, we are out of time for today. If anyone has any other questions for Dr. Spink, I do encourage you all to reach out to him. There's multiple ways to do that on the screen right now. If you have any questions for us here at PJRFSI, you can reach out to us at pjrfsi@pjrfsi.com, or you can go on our website and there's a phone number as well as other ways to reach out. But Dr. Spink, I did want to just say thank you again so much for another great webinar. Every time, great presentation, awesome content. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and taking the time to be with us today.
You're welcome. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you, yes. Thanks, Dr. Spink. Thank you, Amy. Have a great day, everyone.
Yep, thank you to everyone for attending. We hope to see you on another webinar and stay tuned for more details on that. Have a great day.